Carrie stared at the rabbits exploding on the screen as Samuel fired the toy gun at the TV. She had enough of this violence and told him to play another game. She looked to her husband for assistance. He gruffly told Samuel to go get ready for school. Samuel casually turned towards his father, raised the toy gun, and with a maniacally cruel smile for his young age, he pulled the trigger. Make? The droning buzzes. The form of electrical interference. Make. A man's voice, more or less, became more coherent through the static fog. Make sure volume is turned up, up, up. The buzz immediately became an intense ringing in her ears while the words drilled into her skull. Carrie frantically looked around for the source, but the pixels and the ringing made it increasingly harder to focus. Finally, something stood out, floating directly above her. The image made her screech, of which left her mouth like discordant microphone feedback. "We'll watch your kid for you," it spoke in the cheery voice, garbled like was being played through a damaged cassette. Carrie awoke with a start. Her skin still felt the residual itches from her nightmare visions. Ralph was still asleep beside her, snoring into his pillow. She left the bed, walked by Samson's room, taking a quick but worried look inside to find him also sound asleep. Then she made her way to the kitchen to get some water. An Uncle Carter whatever box was still sitting in the corner when she filled up her cup. A frustration built up within her as she stared at it. Why had she even brought it inside? Samson didn't need things like that at his age. She thought about his terrible bloodshot eyes, then gripped her glass harder. She shouldn't have left him alone. What kind of mother was she? The water left her cup before she could finish her irritation-fueled thought, and it splashed all over the box. Oh no, she thought. Ralph wanted to sell that. Paper towels are in her hand instantly as she went to clean up, but she froze as a realization came into view. The box was empty. Where was the console? Somehow she knew the answer, but she felt far too anxious to confirm. Slowly she turned her head until the television came into view within those dark shadows of the early morning outside, and sat beside it was the damn gray box. Several logical possibilities flashed through her mind, but it was the illogical, the impossible idea that stuck. Not wanting to humor her nightmare-rattled brain, she calmly but swiftly went to unplug the thing once again. Her fingers barely grazed the wire before it sent a shock up her arm. Electricity struck up her nervous system and forced her to take her hand away. The console sizzled, almost seeming to snicker at her, and made several electrical pops that sent sparks into the air. Carrie quickly scuttled away, worried over the threat of a fire starting, but the popping died down as she left in a wake of silence that left her feeling absolutely isolated. Pushing herself up off the ground, she decided only one thing could help her. The coffee machine sputtered to life while Carrie leaned over the counter and rubbed her head. She would just have Ralph take a look at it when he woke up, which would be hours from then. When her cup was full, she got started on breakfast, taking small sips to slowly energize herself while the scrambled eggs and sausage sizzled on the stove. "Morning, Mama." Samson's voice made Carrie jump. He was up far too early. Of course, though, he had checked out rather early last night. He mustered a sleepy smile to push down her built-up stress. "Good morning, honey. Hungry?" She laid a plate in front of him and started to pour some milk. Samson poked at his foot, taking small bites of the egg. Despite his long sleep, he still looked exhausted. Bags under his eyes that appeared grafted to his skin, sluggish movements, and slow but heavy breaths. "Can I play my game while I eat?" He was already picking up his plate and sliding from his chair before Carrie could answer. "Sorry, honey, something's wrong with the game." That wasn't a complete lie, she thought. "Dad will take a look at it this morning, then we'll decide if it's safe to play again, okay?" Samson slowly blinked at her. "But I want to play it." His head twisted to look over his shoulders at the television. "You can't, honey, okay?" she reiterated with a bit more force in her voice. Samson looked back at her with anger in his eyes. She had never seen his eyes with real hatred before. This wasn't about to throw a tantrum anger. This was a silent rage she hadn't thought possible from a young boy. She was taken aback by this, to say the least. "Sammy, just wait for Dad to wake up and take a look. It's not working right now." The young boy shifted his glare towards his food before he shoved the plate away and left the table. Carrie watched with a continued shock while Samson stalked to the main bedroom and opened the door. By the time she realized what he wanted to do and was moving to the hallway in order to stop him, Ralph was yelling and stumbling out of the bedroom, his head snapped up to look at Carrie. "What's wrong with your son? You just scared the hell out of me." He looked behind him. "What do you want?" His eyes followed Samson as he walked out cheerily from behind his father and began to pull him down to the living room by his pajama pants. "I want to play my game, Papa. Will you look at it so I can..." "This is over that stupid console?" "Well, no, you can't play with it. I'm gonna sell..." He paused when he saw that it was plugged back in, then he looked at Carrie. "Why'd you plug it back in?" "I didn't," she defended. "It was plugged in when I woke up." "Well, then who plugged it in?" The television buzzed to life after Samson powered it on. The main menu popped into view. The volume turned up this time. Carrie could hear the electronic voice sizzle from the speakers. A full-body shiver overtook her with recognition? "Welcome back, slugger. Are you ready to play?" The voice was jittery, stuttering, with some kind of delay. Samson gave a child's squeal of excitement and picked up the controller to begin. Carrie watched on in a dread silence while Ralph just sighed with exasperation and grabbed some food to eat on the couch. The game selection menu appears with something already selected. The voice returned with an accompanying text box. "You loved Rabbit Run, so let's try hide and seek. Find the cartridge that matches this picture and put it in the gaming slot, slugger." Samson immediately went about doing as his voice instructed and snatched the cartridge up from the box. Carrie remained in her silent trance while a growing terror gnawed at her nerves. Ralph seemed to have zoned out, reading a sports magazine while he mindlessly chewed. The click of the cartridge sent a shockwave up Carrie's spine. Similar to Rabbit Run, the screen flashed before the title card was shoved in their faces. Hide and seek filled up most of the screen as the same multicolored rabbits hopped around the letters. Samson pressed start. The screen went black as 5 little words appeared in the center. "Please plug in shooter extension." Carrie didn't catch the rules of the game. Suddenly aware she had left the stove on and the eggs were now burnt crisps. She turned the stove off and threw away the eggs before looking back as jovial music had started. Samson was aiming the plastic gun at the screen with an intense focus. Pixelated rabbits hopped up from the bushes lining the bottom of the screen. Samson pulled the trigger as one hopped up high. The rabbit burst into a shower of red confetti, while a crunchy firework sound bite echoed from the speakers. "It's a little gruesome for you, Samson. Why don't you play a different game? Okay?" Carrie approached her son, but he only responded by shooting 2 more rabbits. The words "double kill" flashed at the top of the screen. "Okay, that's enough for now." She moved towards the television when Samson abruptly turned to his father with excitement. "Papa, look!" Pointed at the score in the upper corner of the screen. Ralph glanced up from the magazine for a second before returning to his reading. Samson pouted. "Papa!" The boy tried again as he raised the electric gun towards his father. "Look!" Carrie began to reprimand him for making such a violent gesture just before he pulled the trigger. There was no sound from the toy itself. Only the squelch of Ralph's flesh, and his face was reduced to a ripping mess of viscera, and the wall was coated with the gore of his brains. His body slumped back. What was left of his jaw swung from strips of skin and fragmented bone. The magazine slipped to the floor as his arms went limp. The cheer of congratulations from the game was drowned out by Carrie's shrieking unbelief. The body stumbled to support itself after the counter. Her legs quickly lost their ability to keep her steady. Her eyes were unable to turn from the ghastly sight. Its caved-in skull looking ready to collapse fully in on itself. Finally, she managed to screw her quivering eyes shut and blocked out the cadaverous visage. The refusal of acceptance brought them open once more, just to find the same scene again and again, with cerebral slime sliding down the wall. She ripped her eyes away entirely to focus on Samson instead, who had returned to playing his game. The rabbits were shot down one by one. Each time blood exploded from the eviscerated digital creature, it added to the bloody coverage, gradually obscuring the screen. Viscera, similar to Ralph's fate, rolled down the television in pixelation, but still acting far too like real blood. Carrie cautiously approached her son, handling of the wretched controller getting more erratic as the view became blocked by the spreading guts. "Samson, it's time to stop now, okay?" She carefully reached for his shoulder, ready to wrench that awful toy away from his hands. Turned to look up at her, and the speakers began to screech with static. Carrie fell to her knees, covered her ears from the prescient torture. Samson seemed unaffected as he turned back to the television, now completely drenched red from the game. It looked brighter, fresher, almost realistic. She didn't want to humor that idea until her eyes focused on the bottom of the screen. The blood was spilling out of the television, pooling into a growing shadow which crept toward Samson's stationary body. Static eventually died down enough for Carrie to uncover her ears and reach for her son again. And she saw it. The image from her dream slowly emerging from the curtain of blood. A pair of eyes became clearer and clearer. They stared out at her, growing larger as they bored holes into her mind. First pixelated like everything else, then they began to morph, sharpened into a pair of hyper-realistic eyes. She could make out the twitch of one of the pupils by the time they had gone 3 times the size of normal eyes. The reality of this impossibility soon became undeniable. Those eyes were pushing through the screen, and a face was soon following as she watched on, paralyzed by the sight of the eyes poking through the screen to look around. The long eyes protruded out by several inches. They twisted around until they found Samson, then proceeded to stay suspended midair while the face began to push through. Gray-tinged skin stretched out to meet the eyes and pulled them back into the dark sockets that soon enveloped them with transparent eyelids. A pointed nose also extended past the screen before, at last, a smile which sat curled back on the ears framed a spiraling of layered teeth, each tooth perfectly square and flickering with static. "Hey, slugger!" The face vocalized with barely a twitch from its pale lips. "Ready to play?" Samson, locked in a trance, slowly nodded as a smile grew on his face to match the smile of the intruder. Boy reached out to the screen at the same time as 2 grayscale hands pressed against the screen. Instead of passing through fully like the stretching face, only the fingers managed to wriggle past the barrier and stretch towards the child. Carrie, finally freed from her stupor, lurched forwards to wrap her arms around Samson's waist. "No, you don't want anything with him! You don't want to take it from me!" She tried to scramble back, tempted to drag the doll like Samson with her, but the elongated fingers were faster than she anticipated, and were already wrapped around his ankles, trying to pull him back towards the television. Carrie screamed louder, frantically kicking at the fingers, while Samson's body was pulled taut between the opposite forces. "You can't have him!" Her foot kept slamming against the fingers, snaking up his legs. They only pulled harder. She pulled up from her son, wanted to scream once more, but her voice had become too hoarse to produce another sound. Bulbous gray face that snapped from the screen to form into this thing's full head. Hair made of wires were combed back so his huge eyes could stare at her without obstruction. Long gray neck, smooth like plastic, connected with tremors, head back into the screen. As the head snaked towards her, the neck remained ever lengthening, towered over the struggling mother and emitted a broken, hiccuping chortle. "Samson is gonna play with us now, okay?" The electric sizzle and pops clawed at her ears as she fought the instinct to cover them. Her ears instead tightening around her son. Thanks for playing! The imposing smile grew wider and wider as the jaw began to unhinge. Carrie closed her eyes. She would rather die, knowing she tried to keep her son safe, than let fear tear him away from her. But death did not engulf her. Instead, her strength became outmatched, and Samson was no longer in her vice embrace. Her eyes snapped open. She reached for him. No seeing what had torn him away. What was pulling him head first into the television screen? A tongue. A silver, segmented tongue had wrapped itself around Samson's neck. The screen flared with bloody static as the tongue and fingers began their retreat back within. The harsh pull on his neck had snapped Samson from his daze. Immediately his head began to twist as best as it could against the restraint with the hope of finding his mother. His feet kicked against the glass as the giant head vanished past the wall of television fuzz. And he began to scream as his young mind came to understand the reality of his cruel, surreal situation. Carrie jumped back into action. She wrapped her arms around his stomach and used every ounce of desperation she had to keep him there. Samson kicked more at the screen, but the fingers didn't allow enough room for his kicks to be damaging. Carrie braced her feet against the legs of the television, trying to break the screen with him, but each stomp threatened the safety of her anchoring. He just kept screaming, crying out for his mother and for his father, hiccuping in his pleas for help, all the while his face was pulled closer and closer to the screen. Against all the fighting, the kicking at the damn box, trying to pull her son from the monster's grasp, Samson's head connected with the screen, and he wasn't passing through. His screams grew louder, they tore at his vocal cords, and his struggling became more erratic. All Carrie continued to keep just pulling. There was nothing else she could do. There was a sharp tug, and Carrie briefly thought, she hoped, the screen would crack under the pressure of her son's head. The sound of Samson's head cracking against the television echoed in Carrie's ears. The screaming stopped instantly. The only sound left was the static. The fingers continued to pull, but Carrie refused still to let go. Please, she sobbed. Please, I just want my son, please. Soon there was not enough space between Samson's body and the screen for her weakened arms. The sensation of her boy's limp body frayed her resolve. Her arms finally slipped and she fell back. But she didn't look away. She was far too exhausted to do anything but watch now. Watch her son get grounded into a meaty pulp against the television. The skull inevitably caving in while bones popped and eyes leaked into the blood. The gray fingers grasping at everything, they ripped and tore through each extremity until the only solid pieces left were his clothes. Fingers sank back through the screen and the static shut off. Shadows sank over the television, the carpet, and Carrie, all covered in her son's ground-up remains. Time slipped by as she stared into the gore left behind. Only when sirens stopped outside her house did she feel the soreness of hours hunched over. Officers found their way into her blurred vision. They gurgled words down at her that only piled up against her eardrums. Cold steel embraced her wrists, and she was picked up to be graciously pulled away from not only the remnants of her family, but from that wretched machine as well. Police tried to ask her questions, but Carrie knew she wasn't making much sense. It all went by so fast. Insanity charges, mental wards, psychiatrist after psychiatrist, who all tried to convince her what she saw simply wasn't the truth. But she knew what happened. She knew what killed her husband and her son. She knew it to be true because she had overheard some orderlies chatting about the approaching Christmas season. They chatted about how their kids were asking for the same thing. Uncle Carter's amazing entertainment system. That was a shocker. Oh, whoa, what an ending. Ooh, yeesh, ooh. Whew! I thought I wrote dark shit. I loved it. Whew! Alright. Well, I don't know if we can top that one, but hey, let's move on to the next story. The flyers buzzed over the trees, and Daniel could see 2 grabbers and a darter. He tried to shield Sally. He was too slow. The darts hit them both, and he fell into the dark water. He lay scarier than in the arms of the flyers. He heard them through the water. The beings, the squid-like creatures, were coming for him. Daniel didn't sleep a wink that night. He was too traumatized by what they'd seen, and every time he closed his eyes, he would recall Kane's lifeless corpse hanging from that tree. He and Sally arrived back at the village in a frantic state, reporting their grisly discovery. Daniel's father had led a party of men into the woods to recover the body, and Kane's corpse was collected by the flyers soon after. Daniel's mother had done her best to calm and comfort the two before Sally was sent back to her own family for the night. His father had spoken to Daniel later that evening, explaining how Kane had been unable to come to terms with his troubled past, and so he had decided to take his own life. Suicide was what they called it, but such an act of self-destruction was previously unheard of in their community. Once again, Daniel was not satisfied with his father's explanation. He knew his dad was holding something back from him, and Kane's shocking death had made him even more determined to discover the truth. He met up with Sally early the next morning in the village square. The girl wasn't herself. Her face was drawn and her eyes red and puffy. Daniel guessed she had been up all night crying. "Are you okay?" he asked with concern. "Yeah," she replied, brushing it off. "What did they tell you, Dan?" she asked. "Nothing much," he admitted. "My dad said Kane killed himself. It's probably true. He was a pretty messed up guy. Still doesn't explain why or where he came from and why they sent him here." "And who are they anyways?" Sally interrupted. "Who are these people who control our lives and send the flyers? We've never seen them, and our parents won't tell us anything. You know, Dan, I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I reckon there's only one way we're going to learn the truth. We need to leave this island." For a moment, Daniel thought he'd misheard. "Wait a minute," he exclaimed. "You want to leave the community, but that's impossible." "Why is it impossible?" Sally shot back. "We're surrounded by a narrow stretch of calm water. We can see the land on the far side. All we need to do is reach it." "But how? It's water, for crying out loud. We can't walk across it, and we don't know how to swim." "We don't need to swim," Sally answered with a coy smile. "All we need is a raft." Now, Daniel was totally baffled, not to mention a little bit scared. "A raft," he repeated in a baffled tone. "Yes, Dan, a raft. We can build it ourselves. There are books in the library which will tell us how. All we need is logs and cord to bind it together. We can fashion oars from tree branches. We know the water isn't choppy, so we can paddle across in no time. What do you say, Dan? Care to join me on an adventure?" Daniel hesitated before answering. This was undoubtedly the most important decision in his life thus far. He was very nervous, but didn't want Sally to know. What she was suggesting was radical, a clear breach of the community's laws and a challenge to their parents' authority. He knew it was wrong, but that made Sally's proposal all the more enticing, and it meant spending more time with the girl he liked, hopefully impressing her with his bravery. "Yeah," he suddenly blurted out. "Yeah, I'm in." "Good," Sally answered with a satisfied smile on her lips and a sparkle in her eye. "Well, we'd better get started then. We've got a lot of work to do." And so their adventure began. although neither knew where their act of rebellion would lead. It took them a week to finish the raft. They could have completed the task much sooner, except Daniel insisted on caution. They stole only small quantities of wood and rope from the communal stores each day so to avoid detection. Sally took charge of the raft's construction, consulting her textbook and instructing Daniel accordingly. They'd test the craft for strength and durability and, after a couple of short test runs on the water, were both satisfied that the boat would float and bear both of their weights. Well, the oars they'd carved out of tree branches would help propel them across the lake and towards the far shoreline. Daniel didn't know how far it was to the other side. Sally acknowledged it was only a couple of 100 yards, but he thought it was farther. Not that it would matter if the raft sank or fell apart halfway across. There was no way of telling how deep the lake was. But Daniel had waded out to test the waters, getting 20 yards or so before the water came up to his shoulders. Their journey would be dangerous. He was sure of this. Even if they made it across the lake without drowning, there was no way of telling what they would find on the other side. What if the land across the water was populated by violent maniacs like Cain? What if they were attacked, even at this late stage, as they should on the shore, ready to cast off? Daniel still had grave doubts, and he seriously considered backing out. But Sally was determined and would go ahead with the mission regardless, so he would rather be by his best friend's side than let her face the danger alone. And so, the two teenagers stood on the muddy shore, their self-built raft before them and their crude oars in hand. Daniel looked into Sally's eyes and his heart beat faster as she spoke. "Well, Dan, would you care to do the honors?" The boy nodded his head as Sally stepped onto the raft. He gave it a firm push, casting the raft out into the open water. Daniel soon waded in after, jumping aboard the flimsy craft and only just managing to stabilize it before they capsized. The first 50 yards of paddling were the scariest, especially after they went out of their depth. For a terrifying few minutes, Daniel was sure they would sink and drown, but the water was calm and steady, and thankfully their raft had held together. Before long, Daniel and Sally had synchronized their strokes, and soon they were making good progress towards the other side. The couple were able to relax as their journey continued, appreciating the solitude and beauty of their surroundings. The blue sky and shining sun above them and the clear water and shoals of swimming fish underneath them. Daniel admired the nature all around them, but the greatest beauty of all was the girl sat beside him. It was Sally who'd gotten them this far. Her bravery, determination, and adventurous nature. He had fallen for her, no doubt about that. Daniel couldn't deny it any longer. He was in love with the girl. He had to tell her, no matter what the response. Daniel opened his mouth to speak when suddenly they hit a wall. It was only a small bump, but the impact almost threw them both into the water. "What the hell was that?" Sally exclaimed in shock. "I don't know," Daniel answered in puzzlement. "Maybe we hit a rock." But he wasn't convinced. The raft had stopped dead in the water and would not move forward. He inspected the lake underneath their boat, but could see nothing. No rocks, no obstructions. Next, Daniel looked to the far shoreline. Something wasn't right here, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The land appeared to be close, perhaps less than 100 yards away. But somehow it didn't look real. It was as if the shoreline in front of them was a moving picture, if such a thing was possible. Suddenly, the image flickered, as the light seemed to fade momentarily. For a moment, Daniel thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but Sally had seen it too. "What happened there?" she exclaimed. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he cautiously lifted his oar and used it to poke at the air in front of him. He was astonished when his oar hit something solid, a wall that wasn't there. And then it dawned on him. The shoreline wasn't there. It was an optical illusion, an artificial image projected against a giant glass screen. It was all an enormous fake. Daniel was still trying to come to terms with his extraordinary discovery when there was a further unexpected development. The false image flickered again, except this time the picture wasn't restored. Instead, there was darkness, or to be more specific, a dark flowing water. "My God!" Sally swore. Daniel glanced at the girl briefly and saw the fear in her eyes. He shared her sentiments. None of it made any sense. They were floating on water, but there was a wall of water directly in front of them, apparently sealed behind glass or some other transparent material. It was like they were trapped inside a reverse goldfish bowl. But how was this possible? In a matter of seconds, Daniel and Sally's world had been completely turned upside down. Everything they thought they knew about their world had been revealed to be a lie, but the greatest shock was still to come. Daniel looked up and suddenly saw them. 3 creatures, animals of an undeterminable species, their large bodies glowing in the dark water as they swam towards the glass. Daniel had never seen an octopus or squid, but he'd seen pictures in books, and this was the closest comparison he could draw. Before him swam a trio of monstrous giant squid-like creatures with protruding and flapping tentacles, fluorescent skin, and huge saucer-sized white eyes with dark black pupils in their center. On the surface, they appeared to be mere beasts, but when he looked closer, Daniel swore he could see an intelligence in the way they moved and observed him. Daniel simply stood upon the raft, frozen in terror as he stared at these unexplainable monsters, and as they glared back at him, floating just on the other side of the glass. It was Sally who broke him from his fear-induced paralysis. She cried out in terror when she saw the creatures stepping backwards and falling into the lake. Daniel moved quickly, leaning over the side of the boat and grabbing Sally's arm before pulling her back on board. He made sure the girl was safe before turning back towards the glass barrier. The creatures were gone, leaving behind only dark water. And then, a second later, the artificial image was restored, and Daniel once again found himself beholding the false shoreline. Normality was apparently restored, but they were far from safe. Suddenly their attention was drawn to the blue skies above them as 3 flyers appeared from nowhere, approaching their exposed raft at great speed. Daniel recognized 2 of the craft as being grabbers, while the third was an attack drone, the same type which had fired darts at Kane and knocked him out. Realizing the imminent danger, Daniel grabbed hold of the soaking wet Sally, attempted to shield her body behind his, but it was already too late. The attack drone fired a dart at high speed, striking Sally square in the chest. She yelped in pain before passing out in Daniel's arms. The boy screamed out in anger, but knew he could do nothing. There was no escape. No choice but to let them take him. He gently lay Sally's unconscious body down upon the raft and defiantly stood up to face the flyer head-on. The craft fired 2 darts in quick succession, hitting Daniel both times. He felt the sharp pains in his chest and then found himself falling backwards off the side of the raft, hitting the water with a heavy splash. And suddenly he was sinking, the lake water quickly filling up his lungs. Daniel was sure he was going to die, and yet he felt quite calm. As his eyes closed and everything went black. Daniel awoke slowly, his eyes struggling to adjust to the light. He felt very groggy, his body ached, and it hurt everywhere he took a breath. The boy eventually realized he was lying down in his own bed, back in his family home. How was this possible? Suddenly it all came back to him. The illicit boat trip, their startling discovery, the attack by the flyers, darts fired, Sally knocked out, and then he was falling, sinking down into the water and slowly drowning, and yet, here he was. For a moment, Daniel hoped it had all been a terrible nightmare, but then he looked down at his bare chest and saw bandages covering the wounds where the knockout darts had hit him. His next feelings was one of panic. He was here, alive and safe. But where was Sally? The last time he'd seen her, Sally was knocked out cold and floating on top of the raft on the edge of the lake. He had to find her. Daniel attempted to get up out of the bed, but he was lightheaded and weak. Whoa, wait up, Dan. Where do you think you're going? Daniel looked up to see his father standing over him. 6'2" frame filling up the small bedroom. The man's voice was firm, but his eyes were full of concern. Sally, Daniel managed to croak. I've got to save her. Sally is safe, his father replied confidently. The Flyers picked her up and brought her home. She only took one dart, so woke up before you did. She'll be fine, but it's probably feeling as hungover as you are right about now. Besides, you're in no condition to go anywhere, young man. You need your rest. Daniel wasn't convinced, but he was too weak to argue with his father right now, and so he meekly returned to bed. His father returned to the chair in the corner of the room. Well, son, the old man continued, you know you're lucky to be alive. One of the Flyers plucked you from the lake. Otherwise you'd have drowned. Those tranquilizer darts they used are powerful. You've been out cold for over 24 hours. We were worried you wouldn't wake up. Your mother was sitting with you all through the night. She's resting now, which is probably just as well, because it gives us a chance to have a talk, man to man. Daniel was confused, and wasn't just due to his weakened physical state. Aren't you angry with me? He asked. His father shrugged his shoulders before replying. A bit. You disobeyed the community's rules and put both yourself and Sally at risk. But you're a clever boy, and sooner or later I always figured you would discover the truth. Daniel was astonished by his father's sudden candidness, and he wanted to find out more. We saw something out there, he said hesitantly. The lake is surrounded by a giant glass dome, and on the other side there were monsters, horrible sea creatures watching us. Thought it was all a nightmare, but it wasn't, was it? Those monsters are real, aren't they? Yes, his father continued. The man almost looked relieved to finally be able to tell his son the truth. Yes, they are real. Not only that, but the creatures you saw are our benefactors. Or maybe a better description would be our owners. Daniel felt a surge of excitement, but also fear. What his father was telling him was unbelievable, but he still didn't fully understand. What do you mean, owners? He asked in puzzlement. His dad looked thoughtfully, and there was a lengthy pause before he answered. Tell me, son, have you ever heard of a zoo? Yes, Dad, Daniel answered in confusion. I've read about them in books. A zoo is a place where wild animals are kept in captivity, and people come to visit them. I always wished I could visit one. You've done better than that, son, his father answered. You're living inside of one. Daniel suddenly felt nauseous. He didn't like where this was going, but had to know the full truth. You see, son, our generation still remembers what the Earth was like before they came. The fall happened when your mother and I were young. About your age, in fact. It was all so sudden. A bolt out of the blue. We never knew of their existence. When their massive ships appeared in orbit and started pounding the planet's surface with their superweapons, wiping out entire cities and countries in a matter of hours. The world's militaries joined forces and tried to fight back, but their technology was vastly superior to ours, and so we could offer no serious opposition. Virtually the entire human population, billions of people, were wiped out within 48 hours. The planet's surface was left virtually uninhabitable. Only a handful of us survived the genocide. The invaders hunted us down and took us as prisoners, bringing us to places like this, where we're held and secretly watched over by our masters. Perhaps they're studying us, or maybe they're just here to entertain them. Either way, they let us live in peace and provide whatever we need through the Flyers. Daniel was in a state of complete shock. His entire world had just been turned upside down, and he felt as if he'd been living in a dark cave for all his life, suddenly emerging to see the terrible light. He had so many questions that he hardly knew where to start. I don't understand, he exclaimed in dismay. Where is this place? Are you sure we're not living on Earth? No, son, his father answered solemnly with a shake of his head. The Earth is destroyed. We are many light years from our home planet. on board one of their massive colony ships deep in space. Everything around us, is an artificial construct designed for us to live inside. As you've already figured out, the lake is in fact a moat of water surrounded by an enormous dome. Everything inside the glass is manufactured. The air we breathe, the grass under our feet, the sun in the sky, and the moon and the stars at night. None of it is real. Daniel's head was spinning. Felt like he was going to be physically ill. But why? He exclaimed in disbelief. Why would you accept this, Father? They're keeping you as a slave, locked up, and you just let them. What else can I do? His father snapped, with a hint of anger now evident in his voice. They control everything, have the power of life and death over every one of us. Resistance is useless. And besides, we have a good life here. A safe place to live, wanting for nothing. Believe me, son, it could be a lot worse. We're their pets, Daniel muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Yes, in a matter of speaking, his father replied. But look, son, I realize how hard it must be to take this all in. But you have to accept the reality. One day, before too long, you'll be an adult, and hopefully you'll marry and have children of your own. Then you'll understand. You'll see the sacrifices a man must make for his family. I don't think I can ever accept this, Daniel answered, his heart and voice full of defiance. His father sighed and shook his head in despair. The thing is, son, our benefactors aren't always benign masters. They will punish those who repeatedly break their rules. Do you remember Cain? Remember what he was like when he came to us? This isn't the only human habitat maintained by our masters. There are others, and not all of them are like this. The habitat Cain came from, Facility 7, is designed to showcase mankind's more base, violent instincts. The inhabitants are made to fight each other, hunt down their fellow human beings with primitive weapons, often killing one another. Cain was wounded in one such fight, so they brought him here. But the trauma of what he'd suffered was too much for him to bear. That's why he attacked Saul and then killed himself. So, you see, son, if you continue to rebel, the aliens will punish you. But most, also, those close to you, like your mom and I, and Sally. Daniel swallowed, his body shaking. The prospect frightened him, but also made him feel even angrier. What right did these things have to do this to him and his family? How could they be allowed to get away with it? He knew it was pointless arguing further with his father. The old man's mind was set. Well, son, you've been through a lot and you need to rest. He reached over the bed and set down a single small pill on the table side. Don't forget to take your supplement. It'll make you feel better. With that, his father left the room, shutting the door behind him. Daniel was left alone, staring suspiciously at the supplement pill and wondered what he would do next. He met up with Sally the next day, both having recovered from the ill effects of the knockout darts. Neither wanted to speak in the village, where prying eyes could see them. So instead they arranged to meet out in the forest, close to the shore where this had all began. Daniel couldn't be happier to see her. Sally looked tired and worn out, but was nevertheless as beautiful as ever. Her brown eyes lit up as she ran to Daniel, embracing him with a passionate hug which he gladly returned. Thank you, Daniel. You saved my life, she sobbed emotionally. Huh? Daniel replied dismissively. Some hero. I would have drowned myself if the flyers hadn't picked me up. I was so worried, Sally continued. Me too, but we're safe now. The boy realized how ridiculous his words were as soon as he spoke them, because he knew they'd never be safe again. Sally withdrew from their embrace, staring out towards the water. So they told you then? She asked. Yeah, my dad explained it all. Still can't take it in. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Sally interjected. It's like all the pieces have come together. Yeah, Daniel replied, not knowing what else to say. There was a lengthy pause as both stood side by side, looking out towards the far shoreline, which they now knew was nothing more than an optical illusion. I'm not going to do it, said Sally, breaking the silence. I'm not going to play along with the lie. She turned to look at Daniel, and her eyes were full of anger and defiance. Why should we let them get away with it? They destroyed the earth. They're monsters. Daniel looked into her eyes, and all his fear melted away. He felt the same and knew they could stand together, that they could resist the alien overlords who held them hostage. He reached into his trouser pocket and withdrew the single pill which his father had presented him with the night before, holding it out in his hand. "It's the supplements," he said. "They make the adults obey, make them docile. If we keep taking them, they'll do the same to us." Sally nodded her head in agreement, removing her own pill from her pocket. It was as if their minds were working in unison as they simultaneously lifted their arms and defiantly flung their pills into the lake, watching the satisfaction as they hit the surface with a splash and sank into the water. Daniel felt a mixture of exhilaration and sadness. He turned to Sally and embraced her. When face to face with the girl, they came together, their lips locking as they kissed in the very first time. Daniel experienced a euphoria, a powerful tingling through his body. This was the best moment of his life so far. The kiss ended and Sally smiled sweetly to him. They held hands and turned to face the water, watching the false sunset on the horizon. Beautiful, until you remembered it was an illusion. And suddenly his elation was replaced by fear as he imagined the intelligent and all-powerful creatures on the other side of the invisible barrier. Were they watching them now? Had they seen what they'd just done, heard the words spoken between them? Daniel gripped Sally's hand tighter as they both stared into the abyss. Bomb in hand, I nodded to Navigator, her eyes telling me no, and she nods back. It's the only way. I pulled the pin and rushed into the video room. The abomination of Halloween costumes and the grotesque witch with no face stood at the far end. I charged to my fate. A migraine, unlike any other, stretched into every crevice of Pilot's brain. It was as if an idea bigger than what Pilot could comprehend was trying to force itself to be thought. Pilot clutched at his head, afraid it would tear open at any second. The screams and howls from the crew made it clear they were going through the same thing. Pilot writhed on the floor, unable to take the growing pressure in his skull. It felt like nails were clicking through the spongy membrane, akin to looking for a file in a cabinet. As far as the feeling had invaded every pore of his skin, every ounce of his being, it was gone. Pilot pulled off the sheet, costume, and took gasping breaths. Relieved from the pressure, dizzy from the pain, he sat upright as his vision unblurred. Immediately, something at the end of the cul-de-sac caught his eye, as if it were drawing him in. There, far from the rest of the crew, stood a shape. As much as Pilot squinted or tried to readjust his eyes, the shape didn't unblur, as if it were bending the air around it. From what Pilot could see, it was a tall, feminine shape dressed in black flowing robes, much like the pictures of witches that Pilot saw in his research. From the neck up, however, something was wrong. It was beyond having a lack of a face. It was more of an absence of space. There was a constantly, slowly swirling mass of inky blackness where the woman's head should be. From this inky blackness began to ooze a dribbling of tar, splattering on the ground and leaving the start of a puddle akin to thick oil. "Hello?" Pilot called out, getting to his feet and helping Navigator up. The mirage-like being didn't respond. It only tilted its head in a curious manner. "What do you want?" Navigator cried out. The safety officer began to call in a lockdown of all systems. A mental pulse hit Pilot, not as forceful as the initial waves, but still strong enough to stagger. In these pulses, visions were shown. A farmhand out in a field, wiping his brow, sickle in hand, he cleaves through the field of wheat, the soft beige stalks falling with ease. The image quickly shifts to a familiar one, the inside of the hypersleep bay with hundreds of humans in various stages of growth and preservation. Pilot quickly realized the being's intention. It just found a field ripe for harvest. People in the room stood stunned, unable to fully comprehend just what was happening, having been used to years of uneventful space travel. Many were paying attention to the growing pool of ichor growing at the being's feet. That quickly changed when the first appendage rose from the murky sludge. At first glance, it appeared identical to that of a human skeleton, the off-white bones finding purchase on the ground, slowly pulling itself from the tar. The skeleton rattled and vibrated, shakily taking a step forward. Its first step echoed with a wet crack as its tibia nearly snapped in two. Internally holding the pieces together was a fresh oozing flesh, pulsating like a heartbeat. Each step, each shudder caused its delicate exoskeleton to splinter and fray, revealing more of the twisting, sticky flesh underneath. The horrifying Halloween prop gone wrong shambled quickly to the nearest crew member, Medic. It spun its spindly limbs at the poor guy, the sharpened bits of bone tearing away chunks of flesh like a chainsaw to a tree. A ghastly crack emanated from the loosely hanging jaw of the skeleton in sheer delight of the carnage. Hell broke loose. Most of the crew scrambled out of the room as more horrifying amalgamations leaked from the pool beneath the witch. Pilot and navigator spent no time trying to get a better look. Together they scrambled down the artificially lit corridors. Without saying a word to each other, they knew there was one person or thing that could potentially stop whatever was just unleashed into the ship. As they were nearing the historical record of Human Development Wing, they stopped dead in their tracks down a large corridor. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a large, lumbering figure. It stood on all fours, its hooves stomping heavily on the cold metal below. Its lower half was similar to that of a black stallion. The creature's fur shimmered as if a slice of space had made its way into the safety of Charon. Top half, however, appeared to be that of a man's, misshapen, with the disfigured, hunched back. It was covered in tattooed robes and cloth, holding a large scythe firmly in its hands. Instead of a human face staring them down was a rotting, slopping jack-o'-lantern. Seeds and stingy pumpkin viscera oozed from the split grin. It reared up on its hind legs, and with terrifying speed, the nightmare centaur charged. Allowing their instilled training to take over, pilot and navigator sprinted towards the creature. There was an alcove just a little down the hallway. If they could jump in there at the speed the creature was moving, it wouldn't have enough time to stop and turn. The two hearts were racing as they saw this galloping ghoul close the distance, raising the scythe in preparation to swing. Navigator dived down the branching hallway first. Plenty of time to spare. She swerved, reaching a helping hand out, urging her friend forward. "Pilot, come on!" Right in front of the opening, Pilot's foot caught on something, and he tripped just inches from the safety of the alcove. He had enough time to turn his head to see the beast closing in, swinging the scythe down upon him. He would either be sliced in half or trampled by the centaur's gnarled hooves. A quick, sharp hand saved him from their either fate. Navigator had pulled him in with not a second to spare. Frantic, Pilot hugged her. "Thank you, Nav. I almost..." She returned the hug. "Come on, Pilot. Like I could let you get flattened. We're stuck together. Got that?" Pilot nodded, and together they stood up. "Yeah, come on, we gotta go!" They sped down the corridor, hoping to make some distance from the centaur as they approached their destination. The clamoring hoofstep told a different story. They may have only bought themselves a few moments at best. They were too afraid to turn around to see how much distance the creature was gaining. They could practically imagine the curved blade rearing up behind them, ready to swing down and collect the souls of the two Charonites. They slammed against the door in the historical record in Human Development Wing, but as much as they pressed the button, it wouldn't open. "The lockdown safety went and called a lockdown! The hooves were thundering down the corridor, and the two turned to see what fate had in store for them. With nowhere to go, the two helplessly watched the centaur zeroed in on its prey. The two fell backwards in surprise when the door they were leaning on slid open. Out stepped a large figure. A dazzling bright beam of blue light screamed through the air, piercing right through the centaur, leaving a smothering clean hole right through the middle of its chest. The nightmare collapsed forward into a heaping mass of sludge before fizzling into nothingness. "You are an authorized passenger aboard the Charon. I must ask you to evacuate the vessel immediately." "CT!" Pilot hugged the robot tightly. "CT, there's something on board the ship!" CT nodded. "Yes, pilot, I am aware of the anomaly. Safety had alerted me, and I had identified you were on your way to me. It was wise that you had done so." Navigator motioned behind her. "Well then, let's get a move on. My guess is if we take out this thing that's making the creatures, the rest will dissolve. Just like this guy." CT shook his head. "I am sorry, pilot and navigator. I am unable to leave this post. I cannot let any threat harm those in hypersleep. Vitals for several crew members are unresponsive. I will need to stay here. You two will need to take care of this threat." CT motioned towards a nearby table, where two weapons sat. One was a light caster, similar to the one CT had just utilized. The other seemed a little more quickly thrown together, with loose wires sticking out haphazardly. Pilot picked up the strange weapon, while Navigator eagerly grabbed the light caster. "CT, what is this?" Pilot studied the details of the weapon in his hands. He recognized it as a modified trash chute pipe. "Pilot, when the anomaly had entered the ship, I had run a diagnostic on its genetic makeup. There are many unknowns, but I am of a 65% probability rate that this will successfully neutralize what is in the video bay. Do not ask about the missing 35%. CT handed Pilot a small metal sphere with a pin attached. "Pilot, it is recommended that when confronting the anomaly, you should put the safety pin, insert it into that device, and fire. It is also my recommendation that you immediately evacuate the video bay once you have done so." Navigator nodded, powering up her lightcaster, signified by its shrill hiss. "Thanks, CT. You got that, pilot? You good?" There was a hesitation in her voice, one that Pilot felt in his own soul. "I mean, as ready as I can be." Pilot shrugged, his hands trembling. Navigator took a moment to move closer to Pilot and put a hand on his shoulder. The trembling subsided slightly. "Hey, come on. Like you said earlier, we have a lot to be grateful for on Charon. Let's fight to keep it that way, all right?" She smiled. Pilot shook his head, steering and steeling his resolve. "Right." The two left the human development wing, the door sealing shut behind them. Fighting back to the video bay proved to be a lot more difficult than running away. Navigator kept a cool head, vaporizing misshapen Halloween horrors as each hallway became a skirmish, each atrium a battlefield. Imps with too many legs, a werewolf with 3 heads, a sentient chainsaw. Each nightmare twisted into something more sinister. Outfits coated in remnants of sticky tar. Pilot and Navigator hitting the verge of exhaustion. The two found themselves in front of the video bay. The inside was eerily silent. Navigator hovered her hand over the button to open the door. "Hey, Nav." Pilot found his voice shakier than he expected it to be. He felt like he wanted to say something to her, but couldn't find the words. "Yeah, Space Ace? What's up? You good?" He paused for a moment, desperately searching for what he wanted to say. "Good luck in there, all right?" Navigator gave him a smirk. "Thanks, Pilot, you too." With that, she slammed her elbow on the button, readying the lightcaster. The door opened to the sight of a Hollywood slasher, a darkened Halloween cul-de-sac littered with bodies strewn about in a cartoony decorations. There, still standing where it first appeared, was the witch. Slowly, the two entered the room. The shimmering shape made no attempt to move, as Pilot and Navigator inched steadily closer. They were expecting another horrible monstrosity to jump out at them any second from behind an overturned table or popping out of a mangled corpse. But there was nothing. Just two Charonites and a witch. Alright, here goes nothing. Pilot steadied the makeshift device launcher on his shoulders, readied to unpin the payload. At that moment, the witch shifted, and wave after wave of physical energy crashed upon Pilot and Navigator. Pilot gasped as the device was thrown from his hands, shattering against the wall of the video bay. Creatures began to emerge from the small pool around the witch as it played at the last living moments of the crew on repeat in the minds of both Pilot and Navigator. Navigator raised her lightcaster and began to fire it at the sludgelings. "Pilot, throw it! Come on!" she cried out, keeping the rising tide at bay. Pilot gripped the pinned device tightly in his hand. He knew he didn't have the strength to throw the device as hard as he needed to. It would just fly back from the force this thing was exerting. He had to do this a different way. He looked over to Navigator, tears welling up in his eyes. "Nav, I need you to keep shooting at those things. Don't let a single one get me. You got that? Once I'm close enough, you run." Pulled the pin on the device. A 20-second countdown timer flashed on the screen on the device's surface. What? What? Navigator saw the red display of the device and the pin in his hand. No, Flark, no! Drop that thing and let's get out of here! Come on! Pilot took a painstaking step forward, pushing against the witch's kinetic waves. Pilot, no! Pilot! Navigator screamed, firing at the small, skittering creatures as they bubbled towards Pilot. Pilot wasn't listening. Pilot was thinking about every dull day on the ship. The boredom, the aimless life he lived aboard the physical embodiment of Limbo. The waiting space for the next good thing. How foolish he was. This whole time, he had something to be thankful for right in front of him. Someone to share the boring days with. Someone who would make those days just a little bit better. He thought of their conversations, of the lessons with CT. He thought about her smile. How he was going to miss it all. Navigator could barely see through the tears as Pilot steadily made his way closer to the ancient creature before him. The timer beeped, signifying 10 seconds remaining. Up close, the creature was no less terrifying. Intricate charms and silks blurred into the mess of shapes. Pilot stared at the endless, infinite void like he did so many times before. Though it was not lost on him that this would be the final and last time. It was almost comforting, in a way. The nothingness. He pushed his arm up with all of his might into the witch's swirling vortex. As the final digits of the timer ticked away on the device, his vision was filled with light. But then, nothing. With the motes of consciousness he had left, Pilot knew the ship was going to need to go through some changes. Crew would need to be replaced. The ship would need a lot of maintenance. CT would definitely need to place some limiters on what knowledge is accessible to the crew. But something in him was hopeful. At the end of the day, humans have always had their times of struggle. In every situation, however, they have managed to make it through whatever life had thrown their way. And maybe it was because through all of life's winters, they had always been preceded by their autumns. A time where people can reflect on what they have, so that they can be reminded of what they cherish when times get tough. In this very final moments, Pilot knew exactly what he had cherished. Thank you for listening. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The blue might catch up to you if you do not. Be sure to check out more blue horror stories.